Right, well, thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation, the opportunity to talk about the Global Biodata Coalition and our work towards sustainability. The title relates to what I was going to spend a bit more time on, which is defining the infrastructure that we all depend upon and looking at the details of it. I'll touch on that. I'll give a taste of that, but I'll do a little bit what I hope will be framing for the discussion that's going to follow afterwards. So this is an audience that works in and around life science biomedical databases. And so I don't think it takes much persuasion that these are critically important. And if people aren't working on data directly, they're working on tools that will be applied to work on data and so on. So this is a world that knows the importance for our work in this community to continue. We need to have access to data resources. So the databases that capture the scientific output around the world, the primary repositories, the knowledge bases, the model organism databases, and so on. And so these data resources, they exist as a globally distributed infrastructure, and it's an ecosystem of different resources. So they're not in isolation. There are a lot of data flows between them. There are a lot of shared tools, shared ontologies. We've heard a lot about that earlier on. So there's a great connectivity, and the parts are interdependent, and that brings great value. But it also, as I'll come on to mention, brings some risk. And so we think about it like this. We have a sort of huge distribution. We think there are something like 4,000 openly, or to some extent openly available databases that people are connecting to and using around the world. They're globally distributed, they're run globally, but they're accessed globally as well. I'll talk a little bit more about the global core biodata resource designation in a moment, but so we have a group of them that are the big hitters that tend to be quite generalist, the big repositories for genomics, for protein structure, for metabolomics and enzyme data and so on. These are the ones that are used, every few seconds there's a hit on one of their servers. And then we have, going through more and more specialist databases, some quite small and very nuanced databases, but nonetheless still important for their communities. But this is an infrastructure that's unlike other scientific infrastructures, and it's sort of grown very organically. People start off working on a platform, on a method, and becomes a platform technology. They see the need to have a database. They have collaborators who access, and eventually what grows out of fairly localized activity is something that has become a really massively globally important resource. And that's unlike other data infrastructure where you plan from the top down. And what it means is that actually it's not understood where the parts are and what they all do. And I'll come back to talk about that. So it's hugely impactful. So it enables us to do a lot of the work that we do in this community. But of course, it feeds society. It helps us with food security. It helps us with, looking at biodiversity loss and response to climate change. It helps us with health, infectious disease, and many other things. And so it's critically important for science. It's critically important for society as well. But of course, there are. So there's a slide I inserted a big warning sign in the middle, that version hasn't come through. But there are challenges, and actually for a long time, perhaps from the very beginning of molecular biology databases, there's been a challenge in sustaining things. So there's very limited funding that is structured in a way that's fully appropriate for running data resources in this infrastructure model. Funding is typically very short term. It comes from singular sources. There's not so much global cooperation between funders about how you run these resources. And you have an overall globally important infrastructure that really isn't run, isn't supportable or isn't supported like other infrastructures. And so this has been going on for a long time. The components of the infrastructure are very fragile, and some of the most important databases are living on 2 years worth of funding, and then they don't know where they're going next. No opportunity to plan, to strategize, to recruit, to procure, and so on. But of course, currently, one of the major funders of science and life science data resources, the US government has changed its opinions about how it does things, and that's caused huge perturbation and big disruption. A lot of it is the uncertainty because the actual outcomes are not known yet, but there are some direct impacts as well. And we know that for the 52 global core biodata resources, roughly half of those receive substantial parts of their funding from US federal sources, typically the NIH and parts of the NIH. So they're disrupted. But because it's an interconnected ecosystem, everything is pretty disrupted if one thing is disrupted, because data flow, tools are shared, ontologies are shared, and so on. So enter the Global Biodata Coalition. So this is an organization that was established to look at these challenges. It's a coalition of life science and biomedical funding organizations that come together. They recognize that this data infrastructure of all these data resources is critically important for their research programs to continue to deliver. They recognize that it's fragile, that there are risks and it needs to be addressed, and then they commit to finding ways to address it. So we have currently 11 funding organizations from around the world. We have at any one time a number of observer organizations who are, we hope, on a path to joining. But we have a big community, a lot of stakeholders. I'm delighted that we have, so Tony Burdett will be on the panel. He is, until very recently, he was one of the leaders of one of the GCBRs in that community. We have Nikki Mulder and Varsha Kadir, I think, is here as well. So she'll be on the panel. Those are both on our advisory committee for GBC. So we talk to lots of people, but essentially it's about bringing funding organizations into a place where they can fund the data infrastructure, and bringing the data infrastructure into a place where it can work for the funders as well. So I'll just touch on the who, why, and where. This is the work we have to do to understand. So if you go to funders and you try to engage funders to invest in infrastructure, then of course the first question responsible investors always say, well, what are we investing in and what do we get in return? So a part of our work has to be to describe this otherwise undescribed infrastructure, and we use different inputs for that. Just to say, when talking to these potential investors, it's you can paint the negative picture, and there are big risks of things going wrong, that science will fail if we don't address these issues. But of course there are huge opportunities, and we're hearing a lot about modern data science methods and AI, the powerful things that we can do and we will be able to do. So if we get this right, it's not just about averting the negatives. It's really about taking far more opportunities than we can take at the moment. So it's a really powerful thing if we are able to address it. So we take a number of inputs. We know a lot about the global core biodata resources. We have a forum where the leaders of these resources meet, and we share a lot of information. We have information about that we mine from the literature. We can discover through publications that introduce databases and describe databases. We can mine information, and we can look at data citations and other sources as well. And so we can do many things. We find out about the geography of different parts of the infrastructure, relationships and roles between different components of the infrastructure, and we can glean many insights. And so, for example, and these are just anecdotes that we use here and there. So we know that 37.5 million people have been authors on papers or co-authors on papers that cite at least one record from a global core biodata resource. That's a massive number. 50% of all infectious disease publications focusing on pathogens in the last 10 years cite at least one record from a global core biodata resource. Everyone uses these data resources, and it's actually quite balanced. If you normalize for the scientific activity within a country, everyone uses it to a sort of similar extent. There are 17,000 different organizations involved in funding in some way. The data resources are growing in number. So lots of really interesting facts, and we can use these facts to go to different parts of the world and different funders and different stakeholders to describe the system and to help to predict how it's going to respond to investment and different mechanisms for sustaining it. And so this is an example. We can go to a country and say, look, you have this many scientists who are using the system, you have this many databases running for your system, this many scientists contributing to databases, and so on. So we can get some very specific information about how parts of the ecosystem work. So that's just one part of it. On Thursday, the Stewardship of Critical Infrastructure session, we'll talk a lot more about some of the principles we've been working on in the white paper, some of the mechanisms that might be brought into action to build better international cooperation, some work to really diversify our thinking through the Sustainability Lab. We do work a lot on with the global core biodata resources on describing what sustainability means. It means not just keeping everything going, it means being sensitive to requirements, sunsetting things, life cycling data, life cycling services and functions, and so on. Of course, a lot of time engaging new funders of all stripes, not just the national funders, not just the foundations, but you know, pharmaceutical companies and in private sector players and many others. Campaigning, impact studies, and then we run a program, and we'll be running another selection at some point soon to gather in more global core biodata resources. So just finally, it's really important that we can demonstrate that people care about this. And so we have an open letter. We'd really, if you value the data infrastructure and you find it important in your work, then do come and sign our open letter. It really helps us to show names and numbers and parts of the world and types of activity that depend on the data infrastructure, and that will help us better to make our case. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? We are at time, but we have time for one question, so make it a good one. Francis?
Hi, Guy. Hey. Great talk. Thank you. So there are these GBCRs, these resources are, people have to apply to become one, to be badged by your organization. But if they don't apply, they don't get it, obviously. And so there's a group, a very important group of data resources that are never applied.
Yep.
And they probably account for a large percentage of the data use. I'm talking about NCBI.
Yep.
And so how do you work around that?
Well, so one thing we use, so the long tail, or the sort of 4,000 that I mentioned, we're gradually going through all of those. So we're finding the most likely candidates and inviting them to consider applying. But of course, NCBI has, I mean, there are some known gaps, and NCBI has been on our list from the beginning, and for various reasons, they weren't able to apply. We're confident that they will in future, hence a further selection round. But there are a number of other data resources that are sort of, you know, seem to fit the bill, that we would like to we would like to apply, so we can actually test that. But of course, it's a set of, as you know well, it's a set of criteria and an expert an independent review. So of course, everyone goes through that. So we can't be certain, but it stands to reason. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And partner resources as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.